Hi y'all, welcome to my shop. If you're new to wood turning or you're only familiar with turning bowls, which is cross grain work where the grain is running perpendicular to the lathe, as opposed to spindle orientation where it's running parallel with the lathe, you may be unfamiliar with the difference between a bowl gouge and a spindle gouge. And today we're going to talk about the differences. We're going to talk about some of the considerations in buying one, the different types of spindle gouges, and toward the end of the video we're going to get into that biggest challenge new wood turners tend to have, and that's how to sharpen one, and we're starting right now. Spindle gouges are designed specifically for cutting the kind of detail work on what we call center work or spindle grain orientation, where the grain is running parallel with a lathe bed, for turning beads and turning V's and turning coves. Just a wide variety of spindle projects. If you've only been turning bowls, you've been missing out on the pleasures of an awful lot of wood turning projects, such as some of them that are shown here, and it's everything from whimsical animals to boxes and Christmas tree ornaments and many other projects. An example would be, as I'm showing here, cutting details on a box, or possibly turning chess pieces as shown in this chess pawn here. They're not designed for hanging off long ways off a tool rest to hollow out a bowl like a deep fluted bowl gouge. So let's start with talking about the difference in flute design between a bowl gouge, which has a deeper milled flute, might be appropriately called a deep fluted gouge. I didn't quite get that centered. Where it's milled very deep, and it gives you this very high wings that actually, where it curves all the way across the up near the top, and you compare that to a spindle gouge where it might be milled halfway through like this. So given the same bar of steel, this one is going to have, the flute is not as wide as the bar because it's milled deep. On the spindle gouge, it's much shallower, and the flute comes all the way to the edge on the same bar size. So this is a deep fluted bowl gouge. This is a shallower designed spindle gouge. Now, in addition, you do have some spindle gouges that aren't milled quite as deep, and they might be more like this, where they're only milled about 20% deep, and that's for special purposes, and we'll get into that in a moment. Let's talk about the different types of spindle gouges, starting with the standard fingernail grind with a standard spindle gouge, typically with what they call a fingernail grind. We'll get into that in a little more detail later. But it comes in two basic sizes, although there are others, 3/8 inch and a 1/2 inch, and that's measuring the bar width, unlike the way the British measure a bowl gouge, where they measure it from the flute to flute. This actually measures the bar size. The 3/8 inch is perfect for cutting things. According to my wood turning guru Richard Raffin, spindles say 1 1/4, 1 1/2 inch or smaller, tends to use the 3/8 inch gouge. This tends to be my workhorse gouge because I tend to turn smaller items. Larger items doesn't have to be this large, but this is an example. Once it starts getting a little larger, you're going to be better off with a 1/2 inch spindle gouge. So going back to our drawing with the bowl gouge, the standard spindle gouge, all of these are, my intention was to draw on the same bar width. But with a standard spindle gouge, it's milled about halfway down. So it's milled fairly deep, why we call it a shallow fluted gouge as opposed to deep fluted bowl gouge. Now, they have another tool called a detail gouge, and there are no standards, so different people will have a different understanding of what a detail gouge is. But the detail gouge is not milled nearly as deeply. It actually curves up a little bit on the side, somewhat similar to a bowl gouge. But as a result, when you grind it, it's got this tremendous amount of steel under it, gives it a lot of strength for leaning over the tool rest. And by the nature of this, the way the flute is milled, you can make it swept back and make it very pointy to get into very narrow spaces, more so than you could with a standard spindle gouge. I typically use my detail gouge for detail beads on the side of a bowl, and also cleaning up a dovetail tenon at the bottom of the bowl, because it's got a lot of strength to lean over the tool rest. When it comes to making deep V grooves, you just can't beat a skew. But the closest thing to it is going to be this detailed gouge that's ground kind of pointy at a maybe a 35-degree angle. And you can see, you can almost get in there where the skew did before you start scraping the other side. But if you take a standard spindle gouge with the same grind, you're going to have a problem because the wings aren't swept back, and they're going to get you in trouble before the detail gouge would. Now, I think it's important to note that you can only make a cove as you can't make a cove smaller than the bar of your spindle gouge. So, in other words, 3/8, you can make a 3/8 inch cove. If you needed to make a smaller one, you'd need a smaller tool. Or, if you had use the detail gouge, because of its rather pointier shape, you could, even though both those tools are the same size, you could actually make a smaller cove by not going as deep. Another spindle gouge we'll talk about, I'm making a topic of a future video, is the spindle roughing gouge, used for turning blanks from square to round, or to reduce the for long flowing curves, for example, on a handle. Spindle gouges typically are going to have shorter handles, generally no longer than 10 inches. In this case, 7-inch handle is plenty big. And the reason why is they don't extend very far off the tool rest. And you also maneuver them in front of the body. Unlike a bowl gouge that's extending very far off a tool rest, where you've got to have a lot of leverage in a much longer handle. You don't want a handle like that with a spindle gouge. Let's talk about quality of tool gouges and where you get them from. Generally, the best tools have traditionally come from Sheffield, England. They've got hundreds of years of experience making wood turning tools. I've got a couple of Robert Sorby's. They're fine tools, but in more recent years, they've North America, they've started a number of companies that have been making wonderful tools, such as Thompson Lathe Tools, D-Way, Carter & Son, Robust, and One Way in North America all make very fine tools, including spindle gouges. Most tools come handled. You can get Robert Sorby and some of the others made in Sheffield, England without a handle, but not familiar with too many other than Robert Sorby that you can get without a handle. But for all the tools made in North America, you can get them unhandled, and you can buy a very nice expensive handle. This one was a gift to me. But frankly, they're not that hard to make a handle, so I wind up turning all my handles. It makes them easy to recognize. You can get them exactly to fit your hand, so I like to make my own handle, and would encourage y'all to do the same. If you're interested in making a handle, I've got a video on making a tool handle. Now, we've talked about high quality tools. Now let's talk about lesser quality tools. Typically, I would avoid spindle gouges made in China. The quality control is not going to be as good. My personal experience has been that this is especially with spindle gouges, is that the quality control, the heat control, tempering is so poor that the tools are literally worthless. And that's based on my personal experience and a number of posts that I've read, a number of message threads over the years on various wood turning forums. Some of the other tools, not so bad, but avoid the spindle gouge from China. Spend a little more money and get something a little bit better. Get a cheap set of tools, Chinese tools from, say, something the likes of Harbor Freight, or maybe a step up from that is Benjamin Best. You may find that they don't have your standard spindle gouge out of a round bar stock, or if it does, like in one of the Harbor Freight sets, they're just complete rubbish. Some of them, they'll come with a shallower flute gouge that's, instead of made out of a round bar, it's forged and stamped, and it'll have a tang that's smaller, that goes into the handle. These are kind of old school. I think these were more appropriate for furniture turning parts in years past, but clearly I find these for the kind of turning I do fairly useless, because you just can't turn the detail with them. They're too wide to make smaller coves. I just find them useless. So maybe you get one that looks something like this. Maybe you inherited it from your dad. Craftsman, in the old Craftsman sets, they had them. They were a little bit smaller than this. They also had them in, I think, Buck Brothers. If it's smaller than this, you might be able to get some use out of it. But can you imagine taking a tool like this and trying to turn this type of detail? It's just very difficult, if not impossible. So invest in a good spindle gouge. Okay, now the part you've always been waiting for, sharpening, because we know if it's almost sharp, it'll almost cut. Just want to mention, even when you get a brand new gouge, spindle gouge, it very well may need sharpening, because the manufacturer doesn't know what profile you want, doesn't know what angle you want, and so they're just going to put enough of an edge to get it out the factory door. Typically they come with kind of a shovel shape, then you want to change that to more of an elliptical shape. So here's how you get started. First, I want to mention, I believe in using a jig to sharpen with, even though I've learned to sharpen by hand, freehand. For me, it's just faster to use a jig. My wood turning guru, Richard Raffin, says that speedy sharpening is essential when turning for a living. I can resharpen a gouge using a jig in under 20 seconds, but that's way too slow when I can touch up an edge freehand in about 6 seconds. Well, I don't turn for a living, and at this point in my turning career, I don't think I'd ever be able to just touch it up in 6 seconds. So, the difference between 6 seconds and 20 seconds, even if I could do it that fast with a jig, is just not significant. A jig is just easier for me. Click on the link above if you want to watch Richard Raffin's video on sharpening a spindle gouge by freehand method. And a jig will generally only take off maybe 1/1000th of an inch, so it doesn't, you don't remove a whole lot of steel by dressing the bevel. And I'd call it dressing the bevel rather than grinding the bevel, except maybe when you're putting that initial profile on. So it starts. I covered some of this material is similar to what I covered in the video I did on sharpening a bowl gouge. If you're interested in that video, click the link above. The first thing you need to do is shape the top profile. I showed it doing it this way, and that works. Actually, Richard Raffin comes in and does it sideways, and that works too. I've seen folks do it both ways. I think doing it Richard's way makes for a perfectly flat surface. This way you've got to move it up and down because of that convex shape of the wheel. So this might be a little more difficult. So I would probably go with the way that Richard does it. Sharpening dust can be hazardous to your health, whether it's metal coming off the wheel, which is going to be heavier probably than the stone, or the stone powder coming off the aluminum oxide or the metal off the wheel. So use some type of lung protection. M95 or K95 mask will work just fine. Now, a long time ago, I drilled a 1 3/4 inch hole. I would make it 3/4 of an inch. That would accommodate probably easily accommodates your 5/8 inch bowl gouge and anything smaller. Now, I've heard people say that you know, you could get some wear out in the bottom from continually using this. I've measured it and it's perfectly accurate to 1 3/4, and I've been using it for many years. But if you're a perfectionist and you drill it 3/4 of an inch, you can always glue a copper penny in the bottom, and then it won't wear out. So we're going to go ahead and set that. Now, again, I'm using a Verigrind. I set this angle at 23 degrees based on guidance from Doug Thompson. You can find this on his website and download it. I use this for all my gouges, both bowl gouges and spindle gouges. And now we're going to come over here to the wheel. I keep a little cup of water at the bottom of my stand. I got to fill it up occasionally as it dries out, but no problem. But that's based on guidance I got from John Jordan a long time ago. Said his #1 tip on sharpening is always clean out the crud off the tip of your tool. So I do that with an old with my wife's toothbrush. I'm going to sharpen this to an angle for this particular gouge about 40 degrees. Generally on a spindle gouge, 30 to 40 degrees is good. For my smaller gouges, they tend to be a little bit sharper. So I just kind of match the profile. There's all types of jigs that you can use to replicate those settings, and I'll cover those in more detail in a future video. But it could be, once you get it set, cut you out a little block of PVC, mark the gouge on the outside, and have it fit touching here and touching here, and that's a quick setup. Another one, which I didn't find very helpful, is this one from it's like this. It's flexible, and it's marked, and you can actually mark on here. It's somewhat similar. To the various Craftsman, Craft Supplies Raptor jigs, where you touch the wheel. So there's lots of different ways to do it. I'll go into more detail on this in a future video on sharpening accessories and maybe systems. So now you do it. You know, I showed that picture where I did the profile of the top, and you can see where the steel needs to come away, and most of it needs to come away at the tip. So what I'm going to wind up doing is I'm going to sharpen that tip. Keep it moving. Rolling back and forth until you can see the steel's gone away from that profile. Press lightly. If you got aluminum oxide wheels, you'll when you get to that edge, you'll see sparks shooting down the flute. You don't see that so much on a CDN wheel. Now, people always ask, what grit wheels do I have? I have an 80 grit coarse grit and a 180 grit fine grit. Some people advocate for finer grits. This seems to work for me. And I'm just checking that, make sure I can't see that flat edge anymore. This would have probably been a little bit faster doing it on the coarse wheel, and then I could have tuned it up on the fine wheel. And this is slow with a 180 grit wheel. If you had a 500 grit wheel, this would take even longer if you don't have it exactly right. So you need a coarser wheel to do major reshaping. Just about there at the tip. Now I'm going to grind the wings, and I'm going to stop short of the tip, but I'm going to rotate it back and forth. I don't like an extreme swept back grind on my spindle gouge. I like it swept back a little bit, but not a lot. That's just about there. Not as much steel to grind on the side. Again, keep it moving. About got it. Now you're going to take a couple of passes where you're going to blend the side across the nose on that joint. And that'll do it. Now, similar to when you're doing a bowl gouge, what I like to do is knock the heel off. I generally do that with a coarser wheel. Just on the coarse side of the wheel, after I've turned it off, it's slowing down. Just to get rid of that edge that might rub. And there we go. Nice, sharp, crisp edge. Common mistakes. Common mistakes are how you hold the jig. You never want to grab the handle down here because you'll have a tendency to want to lever it into the wheel. And you want very light pressure. Remember, you're not grinding the tool, you're dressing the bevel. I keep my my left hand on the knob to use that, and then I keep my right hand behind. Now, some people advocate grabbing it underneath. I don't like to get that close to the wheel. And so holding it back here works for me. There's a nice balance between this and holding it here. About 1 finger pressure, that's all it takes, not a lot of pressure. So the number one mistake is not replicating it, and again, that's where those jigs come into play, so you get that same angle. But generally I don't use a jig to set that angle. I generally just put a light here, get down and look at it, and then of course I didn't show you, but that tip that I typically use and I urge people to do is use a Sharpie, and I like to have a drawer in my sharpening system to keep some of these kinds of things like a toothbrush and all. And then you can, when you're setting it, you can just turn this and see whether you're getting a nice smooth bevel all the way across before you start turning it on and dressing that bevel. Another mistake that people frequently make is they just constantly go all the way over, all the way back, all the way over, all the way back. And that might work on some gouges, but typically the flute design is such that you got more steel in some places than others, so they need more grinding. It's that simple. Grind away the steel that doesn't need to be there. Don't keep grinding away the steel that's already gone away where you don't need to grind anymore. So that's a common problem. Probably the number one sharpening issue is people not sharpening often enough. And how do you know when to sharpen? Well, there's a number of indicators. Number one, you're having to press harder. You're getting some vibration. You're getting some chatter. Those are all indications that you need to stop and sharpen. As noted, Woodturner Alan Lacer comments, you can't ruin your tool by sharpening it. You can only make it shorter. If you got any comments or questions about sharpening them, leave them in the comments below. I've got a link to a great video on how you actually develop those skills using a spindle gouge, so you might want to check that out. Y'all stay safe. Come on back here.